What's up, Internet? Welcome to Mike Does Voiceovers. My name is Michael, my apocalypse bunker is fully stocked, and I can't leave my house for at least the next 2 months, so I figure now's the perfect time to wrap up some loose ends from our conversation on Irish consonant mutation. If you missed the first part from like a year ago, be sure to check it out. I'll put one of those badge thingies up here and I'll link it in the description. But to sum it up, the mutations we see in modern Irish come from contextual changes in older forms of the language. Not only that, but each change follows a pattern. For Eclipsis, your mouth is moving the same way, but your vocal cords are engaged where they usually aren't. For example, an eclipsed p becomes b. My mouth is doing the same thing, the difference is all in my vocal cords. And for Lenition, the same parts of your mouth are moving, but in a different way. For example, an eclipsed b becomes v. That's my lips and teeth, but they're moving in a different way. Which is all well and good until we get to the lenited forms of t and d. A lenited t becomes h, and a lenited d becomes r. This flies in the face of what we just established. Unlike for the rest of our lenitions, the same parts of our mouth are not moving in the lenited sounds. How did this happen? Well, Penn State faculty member and Harvard PhD Elizabeth Pyatt might have an answer for us. Now, before we dive in, I recommend that you take this all with a grain of salt for two main reasons. First of all, this is just one linguist's perspective. As far as I can tell, there's not exactly a consensus on this issue. Secondly, this is very much an area of linguistics that I did not study, so this is kind of new territory for me as well. My interpretation might not be 100% here. With that said, let's take a look at Pyatt's argument. The first thing to note is that the sounds we would expect a lenited t and d to become, th and v respectively, are, in Pyatt's words, relatively marked. That is to say, they're pretty rare among world languages. If you remember our first discussion on Irish consonant mutations, though, you'll recall that those sounds were present in Old Irish. Pyatt proposes that Old Irish allowed those sounds through, quote, deactivated marking statements that, for one reason or another, became reactivated by the time the language evolved into modern Irish. So if my understanding is correct, here's the solution we're proposing. Lenition in modern Irish still does the exact same thing that it did in Old Irish. However, new rules have emerged, or perhaps re-emerged since then, that render some of those mutated sounds ungrammatical. So, those newly ungrammatical sounds are changed or repaired to the sounds that we see in modern Irish in accordance with those rules. Let's see how that plays out with each sound, starting with T. According to this theory, a lenited t becomes th, just as we would expect. However, th is no longer an acceptable sound in modern Irish because this rule, which was not present in Old Irish, now applies. This rule tells us that non-sonorant sounds, those produced with an obstructed airflow in the mouth, made using the front of the tongue, cannot be both continuous, like f or ah, and non-strident, that is to say, made with the front of the tongue. This is a problem because th is made with the flat front of the tongue, producing an obstructed airflow. So how does modern Irish deal with this? To hear Pyatt tell it, Irish repairs that unacceptable th sound by simply removing that coronal feature, basically making the same sound just without moving your tongue. Watch what happens. My lungs and vocal cords are doing the same thing, the only difference is where my tongue is. So let's take that same process and apply it to a lenited D. A lenited D becomes V, just as we would expect, and the same rule applies. But that leaves us with a voiced H sound, which is something like It's a distinction that's almost impossible for me as a native English speaker to hear or articulate, and one that might not actually exist. Apparently H is way more complicated than I thought it was, but that's probably its own video. The point is, a voiced H is not a sound that exists in modern Irish, just like a voiced V. So what do? Pyatt posits another repair rule, this guy, which says that consonants cannot be voiced and without a place of articulation. Basically, if you're pronouncing a consonant in Irish and your vocal cords are turned on, your tongue, lips, and/or teeth better be moving too. So to fix that unacceptable voiced H sound, Irish moves it to the nearest place of articulation it can, the velum, or the soft palate, giving us that sound. And boom, we've solved Irish consonant mutation. Easy, right? Yeah, not exactly. Now, I'm far from a professional research linguist, but I do have at least a bachelor's degree's worth of linguistic knowledge under my belt, so I have some credentials to critique theories like this. Not only is this theory super complicated, for my taste, it relies a little too heavily on the unconscious machinations of our Chomskyan language processing device. Theories like this, while impressive and compelling, risk becoming so abstract that they end up having little to nothing to do with how native speakers of the language actually use, understand, and interpret it. I'm sure if you walked up to any old Irish gentleman in the Gaeltacht and asked him to explain a lenited T to you, his response would not be, well, a lenited T is a th, but of course we can't make that sound in the Gaelic, so it must be repaired to a H in accordance with the newly reactivated marking rules. Did that sound even remotely Irish? Was that offensive? I don't know. However, I do like this theory a lot for one reason. It allows lenition to behave consistently. According to Pyatt, lenition always does the same thing to plosive consonants like t, d, p, b. It's just that in the case of T and D, the results of that lenition are no longer acceptable. Otherwise, we would have to accept that lenition does something different to T and D, and only T and D for some reason. And I think that explanation would be a lot more difficult to account for, maybe impossible. Thank you for watching. I hope that made at least some sense to some of you, and if I'm really lucky, actually cleared some things up for a few Irish learners out there. Be sure to leave a comment below if there's another topic you'd like me to tackle, and subscribe if you want to see more language, history, culture, and memes.